Right, take two. We're running. Twitch is working. Things are going. Back at it. Max for live. Noodling, rambling. Twitch only this time. Get rid of Facebook. Can't be bothered organising two streams at the same time. We're back on the granular thing. We're getting near the end of this device now, I think. There's not much more, really, we probably need to add. I think the one thing I've mentioned in numerous streams that we haven't quite got around to doing is drag and drop sample loading. So as well as being able to record by chucking it on an audio device, we'll be able to drag a sample in and mess around and granularize it. So might as well do that, just for the hell of it. And we'll probably want to actually be able to change the size of the recording buffer. At the minute it's hard coded to be 5 seconds long. But, you know, I think we might as well have a way where we can actually mess around with that ourselves. That'll probably be on today. Got a really nice error on my laptop at the minute where the audio just continually keeps disconnecting. Had this issue before the last few weeks, still haven't found a fix. Yay, probably something to do with loopback and the weird streaming setup that is going on. But let's crack open the device. Not very far if the audio engine crashes every second, but we'll see what we can do. So yeah, previously this has just been a audio effect, effectively. You just drag it onto a track and it granularizes, granulates, whatever, messes around with the incoming sample. Or incoming audio, whatever you happen to run into it, you can granulate it up, which is kind of the idea. Definitely kind of something pretty focused on live input, live instruments, and messing around with them. If you start adding drag and drop sampling, obviously that's a way you can quickly get into messing around more as a traditional sampler. So that's one good thing to add, and even after that we could maybe add some kind of MIDI triggering as well to make it a bit more traditional, work a bit more traditionally like a sampler as well as in its current kind of pure audio effect form. So, drag and drop sampling. Going back quite a few videos, effectively, you might remember we have a few objects, generally when you're programming in Max or Max for Live, that deal with samples. Especially when you're making something like a sampler, you need it to be able to operate very quickly. So you need to be able to access the sample in RAM, so you can load it up, load different bits of it, glitch it up, mess around with it really quickly. So in Max, the object you use to do that is buffer tilde. Tilde at the end of objects just make sure you know it's an MSP object or a DSP kind of audio object. So in this object, we've got some buffer objects which deal with loading samples into memory. Info tilde allows you to get info from a sample, sample rate, sample length, lots of kind of info like that. Poke is another object we've used here, actually just used on the envelope, but that allows you to write values into a buffer if you say want to design an envelope like this. And there's also the record object, which is somewhere down here, it allows you to record into the buffer. And finally, in our grain itself, we're actually using play objects. Play tilde is one of the objects you can use to play back a waveform you've loaded into a buffer. You can also use wave tilde, groove tilde, index tilde. There's quite a few different objects you can use to play back, but play is the one we've ended up using, and wave for the envelope just because it worked a bit better. So at the minute we're using, to get audio into our granular synth to granulate, we are using the record tilde object, which is done pretty well for our purpose of a live instrument-y, glitchy, granular effect. But if we want to drop in audio, we're going to have to do it in a slightly different way. You don't kind of load a sample into another player and then kind of play it into the record object in like non-real time. That'd be a bit weird way of doing it, although possible. At the minute with how the device works, you could kind of load a sample up in a clip and play it in and record it, but that's a bit long-winded. Instead, we just want a nice way to do drag and drop sample loading. Luckily, with objects like buffer, if we have a look in the help file, there is actually a way where you can load objects sound files in quite easily just using a series of messages, and it just loads that sample from your hard drive straight into RAM. So you can use the read message. There's also a message called replace you can use. You can see all of those if you look in the reference. Generally in that objects help file, you can see the list of all the messages it accepts and what they do. So we're probably going to be using read, unless replace does something specifically useful. I can't remember. Doesn't set the duration. Okay, maybe. We'll have a look. But anyway, so we're not going to be recording into the buffer anymore. We're going to be reading a specific sample file off our hard drive. So we could just find hard drives in Finder, find their hard drive location, and type the message read with whatever the hard drive location and name of the sample is. That's pretty long-winded. So we're going to want to do something a bit more useful, a bit better than that. Going to make another buffer object and point it at the same buffer. Pretty sure that doesn't cause a problem. Yeah, so that's kind of our original buffer, and these ones are just allowing us to send extra commands to that same buffer. So we're going to highlight it red again just so it's nice and visible. So as seen when looking in the help file, we need to send the read message or the read command to buffer to read in a new sample to it. At the minute it's down here just with its default size of 5 seconds. So like you might have seen, Max has some default loops built into it. So it seems like there's a loop that's just in the default file path of Max called drumloop.af. Yeah, it looks like it. So if we just send the message read drumloop.af, we have loaded in, as we can see in our sample waveform view up here, a drum loop. Who knows what it is? Is the audio working? If so, we might be able to very quickly see what the hell this sample is. Pretty quickly got pretty glitchy. Some kind of general drum loop. It'll do. But we want to be able to load in whatever we like. The other thing we might notice really quickly is weird length here. We have defined the length of the buffer down here as 5 seconds. And I think that's the difference between the read and the replace message, because we've used a read message. It's read the sample in, but it's left the sample being the same overall length, meaning there's a load of dead space at the end. Or if we'd have previously recorded and filled up this entire 5 second buffer, we'd have loaded in the sample just to the correct part. So I have a feeling if we again crack open the help file, look in the description, reads a wave file, wave or AF or other kind of file into the buffer, but it also does something with the length. So it always starts loading the sample in at 0 and it just goes through to the end, but it doesn't override the currently existing size. So one thing we do want to do is every time we load in a new sample, we actually want it to change the length of the buffer to be the correct size of the new sample. So instead, if we use the replace message, send a replace drum loop AF, we should now see we've actually automatically resized the buffer to be the correct sample length for the sample we've loaded in. So now there's no dead space at the start or end, and we've got just a full sample in there ready to mess around with and granulate and stuff. One thing you might have noticed, technically a lot of our play controls are technically operating over the 5 second time, because inside our grain, you may remember a lot of the things going on inside the granular engine itself, such as the code controlling how long it should play for, the direction, the duration. Lots of these bits of code involve knowing how long the sample is. So a lot of the code to do with the playback engine, you need to know how long a sample is to correctly make the sample playback properly. So generally I can see I've written in the defaults, because our default behavior with this device is that it's a audio effect with a 5-second buffer. So by default, a load of the objects are defaulting to this 5-second long length. But because we've now changed the sample length by loading in a new sample, we need to change this value object, which stores the sample size. And that should mean when we load in new samples, all of the places in our playback engine that need to know how long the code is, generally in here it's anything with the message 5000, we're going to update these value objects, and from then on the playback engine will correctly know the length of the sample and operate correctly. As we could see when we just messed with the granular engine there and turned on scanning, it actually kind of stopped working at that point because there's a few dead seconds at the end, because the sample we have loaded in is actually shorter than 5 seconds. So every time we load in a new sample, by doing something like sending a file name with the message replaced to a buffer object, we actually need to bang this info object, which gets information about the sample. One of the things it can do is get the sample size. So now the sample size, rather than being our original 5 seconds, the sample size is actually about 3.5 seconds. And that's now updated the value object, which is storing the sample size. And this same value object is called in our grain bit of code in many places, such as here, not there, down here, everywhere we need to know the sample size. Hopefully I've correctly beforehand added a value object. So now this value object is going to update, and all of these objects here, which were defaulting to a value of 5000, will now have a value of about 3.5 seconds, which is the length of our sample. So if we now again try playing back with the scan on, we should see it correctly lasts just for 3 seconds. And we're getting this weird granular time stretch loop, and it's happening the right length. Can kind of reverse it. Yeah, so with the granular stuff you can do some pretty fun, weird time stretching like stuff. Actually sounds pretty accurate. And because we've done this kind of time stretching-y thing where the playback is decoupled from the pitch, we can actually do things like change the pitch. So it's still taking the 3.5 seconds long the sample is, but we can actually decouple and affect the pitch separately. So this is a lot like, well, similar but not quite the same to things like the beats mode kind of algorithm in Ableton, or maybe more like the texture one. You can have a lot of fun kind of messing around with scanning position, messing around with pitch and the density to get these weird, almost sounds a bit kind of phasery, flangey with the different. Alright, I need to stop that before I faff around making weird little time stretch granular sounds for hours. Right. Cool, so now we can replace it, and we know we need to bang this to update the new sample size and go back to make sure all the internal playback engine code is now working at the same sample rate. But obviously, yeah, we don't really want to be obviously inside the device clicking different buttons to make it do stuff. That's not a good idea. Bang well file operation read complete. Boom. So basically what we want to do, we want to load in a new sample. Just double these over here again, because you can have multiple info and buffer and value objects and write to them in different places in the patch. So we've got a buffer object. We're going to send it a replace message to load in a new sample when the file read operation is complete, because loading very large, I mean, if you're trying to load in like an hour-long sample or something in here, God knows why for this particular device, it might take a while to load into RAM. Once it's finished loading into RAM, you get a bang out of here. That bang will update, will get the sample info. The main one we're just looking for is the total sample time. that will update the value. We end up with something like that. But, as said, loading a drum loop in this way, not very useful. We don't want to be typing in sample names on our hard drive trying to work out what they are or where they are. Instead, what we want to be doing is making a nice drag and drop sample interface where from anywhere in our file browser or whatever, we can just drag in samples and load them up straight away. So there's a few objects you can do that with in Max. One is called drop file. This is the native Max version. Let's crack open the help file, have a look at it. So it provides a nice user interface, and by that I mean an entirely just blank window with nothing there. So you can put it on top of a sample waveform or something like that. Actually, you can just drag a file from your hard drive, your Explorer, what would you call it? File Explorer, whatever they're called. I can't remember at the minute. And dropping it on here will output the file location. So, for example, if I do, I don't even know what this is, some random something about furries. Oh, yeah, some beam about gigolo furries. If you drag that onto here, it will tell us the hard drive location of where that is. Oh yeah, it's in the cloud, so it's technically got weird. But that's the file, that's the hard location on a hard drive where this file is. And that's what sample players or bits of software need to load samples. They need the hard drive location of the sample. So you can have drag and drop interfaces like this. It happens though, oh, and with that one you can make sure you can limit it so it can load folders or samples or whatever kind of device you need to drag in, because you might have a thing where you want people to drag in a folder of samples or something like that, if you want to be able to drag in a whole folder and switch between the samples in real time or something. But it happens, there's actually a live specific object called live.drop. Looks like your native live file dropping interface. The advantage with this file interface or dropper is you can actually drop directly from clips or things in the live browser. So as well as being able to drag from your operating system file explorer, we could actually drag a clip or something from the live browser on top of here. It would automatically do the job of getting the file location for us, which is pretty damn handy. So what we'd probably want to do is have that in the user interface kind of hovering somewhat over the sample interface, but we'd only want to view it at certain times, basically, I think. But what we should be able to do, if we have a look in the help file now, remember what the hell it does. Can you specify what type of things you can drop onto it? Because we really only want we only want audio files. If we let anything be dragged onto it, that'd be a bit useless. Does it allow that? Maybe we'd have to even do something different to work that out. We'd have to check if it was like a AF file or something. Anyway, the point is we should be able to drop this into the user interface. Let's just do a quick test, for example. Let's chuck it right at the end of the device over here. And if I quickly make a message box outlet, put this in the user interface as well, we should be able to drag, I'm hoping, even like a clip into the live dropper. So if I shut the Max device for a sec and go to Ableton, we can see our file dropper's over here. No file's been dropped into it. If I quickly did something silly like grab any old random sample, I should be able to drag this in here. Boom. So as soon as I drag and drop the sample, it's giving me the hard drive location of where that sample is. Or I'm hoping what I can do is actually drag directly from a clip. Yes. Boom. Nice. So yeah, I can actually drag directly from... Ooh, that is a very long clip. Let's not use that. What the hell is this? Who knows? Some random crap. These are all way too long. Anyway, the point is I can drag from clips, or I can drag from the Ableton browser, as well as being able to drag from the normal operating system file browser. And now I've got that location of where that file is, which means I can load it into a sample engine and granulate it up. So that is working, which is good news. into the code. This needs to be in the user interface, but it only needs to be in the user interface some of the time. We don't really want it in there all of the time. So I think we're going to want some kind of button. We're probably going to want a live.text to make a toggle button. And we're going to want to switch between, what do you call it, like record mode, record and sample. I mean, but the recording is a sample as well. I don't know how to word that for now. We're just going to say recorded. Oh, sample drop. Sample drop. Does sample drop work? Oh, shit. Cannot type today. Sample drop. Let's call it that. Why not? It'll do. One thing I remember I also did was I made a quick way to clear the sample as well, which can be handy. So I'll make one other. Oh, geez. One other live.text. I'll label it clear because it's going to clear the sample. And it's just going to be momentary. And whenever we click it, we just want it to clear the sample. In fact, I'm going to put that over here. Why not all in one place? There you go. And then in our sample, in our user interface, we're going to end up with something a bit more like this, I think. We're going to have this hover over the sample view. Background of the sample is black, so we are definitely going to want the text here to be white. Something. I don't want it to drop something here. I want to make sure it's dropping a sample here. So we're going to change the sample legend to drop sample here as well. We're going to have the option to clear the sample always, because you might want to do that. Oh, that's kind of ugly. Well, suck it. It's going to have to do. Something like that in the user interface, but the difference here is what we're going to want to happen. Let's get rid of you for now. Chuck you back here. What we're going to want to happen is whenever we turn sample drop on, we are going to show the sample drop user interface object and allow people to drop samples into it. When we have sample drop turned off, who cares? Let's get rid of it. Get out of the way so we can properly see our playback and stuff like that properly. So, as we've used before, there is a nice command in Max called hidden, which makes an object disappear. So I think what we should be able to do is something kind of like this. Ooh. When it is on, we want it to show. So we need to do the old classic inversion trick here, which we will do with the old inverted 1. Minus 1, but inverted. So 1 minus whatever this number is, which should give us a 0 when sample drop is on. So it's going to turn hidden off, because obviously this command is hidden, and it makes it hidden. So when 1 is on, it's hidden. If you wanted the opposite of this to be visible, which would make more sense, because when sample drop was on, we could make this visible. When sample drop was off, we could make it invisible. But as we've got hidden, we need to invert the command beforehand. So that should mean, if we go back into our user interface, sample drop on, drop sample appears, sample drop off, user interface disappears and gets out of our way. Just what we want. And clear should clear the sample. So we could, so we just actually need to do the code properly and link them up between these bits here now. Sample dropper, I think, will, with any luck, just output what we like, exactly how we like it. Ooh, type-coded drop file. We need to use that. So we want to limit what people can drop on here. We don't want them dropping image files, folders, all kinds of other random stuff that would then be tried to load into a buffer. Some kind of error message would pop up saying, you can't do that. So what we probably need to do is, as far as I can remember, buffers in Ableton generally only work with raw, uncompressed audio files. They probably want WAVs, AFs. I don't think they work with flags. Oh, here you go. AF, Next, Sun, and WAV. Well, God, I think Next and Sun are such incredibly old formats from what I know. I don't know nothing about them, so I'm assuming they just do not even nearly exist anymore. What we're going to want to do is have some kind of gate system, I think. Path name of the dropped file. So we only want to let through the dropped file. Let's imagine this is our system here. We only want to let it through when it's of the right type. So we want to have some kind of select object. And I think we want to select WAV. We want to select AF. I do not even know if this is the case, but let's just imagine you have all these weird things. Sometimes AF is just like with one F. Does it matter if it's caps or not caps? Who knows? We're going to find out now. So I think, just to be safe, and we can test this later on, if the file type we drop into the file type comes, in fact, let's just try something out. Why not? Screw it. Can I drag from here to there? I don't know. I do not know if I can do that. Can I drag direct here? I can. Boom. Oh, wave has an E on the end. Okay, we actually need to have wave with an E in here, and that's caps. What if I get another kind of file? Do I have any AFs in here? Give me some AFs. What happens if I drag this in here? AF, capital F. So I think potentially the only extensions it gets are wave and AF. This will not work as far as I know with an MP3. You'd need to decode the MP3 beforehand. Maybe it does work with an MP3 these days. I don't care, MP3s can piss off. Decode it beforehand, render it to a sample. You do the work. We are not going to do that work for you. Not today anyway. I may have gone overboard here, but I like the fact that this is pretty gonna probably work with any type of file you could possibly think of. So whenever we receive one of these options, we want to open up the gate. Boom, 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 boom. Connect all those up. Whenever we receive one of these things, this gate is going to open up. Whenever we receive not one of those things, we want the gate to close. So we'll also make a trigger 0. That close, oh, it's going to do some more stuff as well, I think. Trigger 0. And we could also do something clever, like send them a message saying, you tried to load a file, a bad file, you did a bad thing. Maybe we'll try and do that as well. Gonna run out of space, but yes, we're already hitting space. Let's get this out of the way of this pile of code and go over somewhere clear over here. Cool. Sample drop space. Turn on sample drop. Sample dropper becomes visible. It allows us to drop a sample. We work out what the type of sample that's been dropped on is. If it is WAV, wave, AF, and all these other varieties, it opens the gate. And remember, Max operates right to left. So what's going to happen here is first thing you do when you drop the file on here is out the right outlet, we're going to find out what type of file it is. Then it's going to try and output the file location so we can load it in, which is useful to us because that's going to allow us to open the gate and do some other coding if necessary, such as tell people off that they've tried to load a bad sample. So one thing we could do is we could also have something like a comment object. We could have a new live.comment. Let's see if this is going to work. We're going to want the text color to be white because it's going to go on top of the device. And if someone drops in a bad sample, we're going to do some weird bits of code here. Why the hell not? Fancy coding. Whenever someone drops in a bad unsupported, I'm writing into the comment object unsupported format. Unsupported format, exclamation mark. Try again. And what we do is we drop that on top of here. And whenever someone, let's just make that bright red. Maybe? I'm going to have a think about this at some point, but the idea is we'd want them to drop in a... Can this have a background color? No, it cannot. Think of a way, because also if you tried to put this text on top of an existing sample, it might just be a bit ugly. Maybe we'd have a background border thing as well that would appear. We're getting onto designing fancy user interface stuff again, rather than doing what we actually need to happen. But hell, let's make something good. So whenever someone drops on a file we do not like, we need to, let's again use our old friend, the hidden message. So when a file gets dropped on that is bad file, it says unsupported format, try again. And what we're going to do, we're going to make this kind of flash up, I think. We're going to make it flash up and then disappear. You don't want it just to hold on forever. So what we're going to do is we would make a delay object that lasts for 1,000 milliseconds. Let's do that. Going to make a temporary display that lasts for 1 second. And so the first thing that's going to happen is we are going to send a bang through to show this. So we're going to make it unhidden by sending it 0. After the delay of, actually let's use a pipe because pipe just sends. Pipe is like a delay, but you can send anything into it. Actually no, let's use delay because it's clearer for this code example. After 1 second, it should then make it hidden again. So hide it. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a, what is it called in Macs where you just have like a panel. There you go. We're going to make a black panel object, and whenever we want to drag a sample on, we're actually going to make the panel object appear really brightly over the top of the sample area, or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to make the border color of this white as well, just so it really sticks out. We want it to be a straight square, no stupid border color, no stupid interior color, just straight back please. Highlight, we're going to have a border color of white to match the other one. And so what's going to happen is this is going to get exactly the same actually. It's going to get unhidden and then hidden. Let's try layering these up in our user interface to make a nice usable user interface. That needs to be at the front. So like in Photoshop or something, if you're layering up user interface objects, you need to define which ones are in kind of a layer. One can be in front of the other and things like that. So what we'd want to do is make this go back a level, which I think you can do with the object. Send it backwards by 1. We are going to want it to be, oh my god, so many things here. Which one's the actual layer? That's a waveform. Okay, that went way too far back. These need to go back 1. That needs to go 1 step back. So we need to have our sample, our player, which actually needs to be on top of that. This needs to be on top of them. Has it still got an annoying gradient on it? It looks like it's got a screw you gradient. Straight black. Thank you. This needs to be on top of that, and then that needs to be on top of even that, and I'm going to drag it out the full width and center it. Okay. By default, you need to be hidden. Hide unlock by default. Cool, so by default sample drop looks fine, you can't see anything. As you turn on sample dropper appears. Oh, it also lists what the last file name you tried to load was. I guess that could be useful. Unless I can turn that off. Do I need it to... Oh, it might even attempt to decode an MP3 into an AIF. Will it? We'll find out. We'll work it out. That's nice. I didn't realize it even tells you what file you've tried to load. But what we could do as a test is if I tried to drop on something it will not accept. Let's try and drop on our weird gigolo meme thing I happen to have here. It should say, oh, unsupported file format, and then disappear. That is good. We might need to make it last for longer than a second though. Let's make it last for 2 seconds. And when that unsupported file format message appears, we want to also do something up here. We want to make this disappear. Let's make another pair of panels. This is going to get confusing, but I think it'll make more sense programmatically. One more panel, and that panel needs to be on top of the others. It needs to go back one level, but remain above the other levels. Oh, layering. I'm sure people who do work with images are just laughing at how simple this is compared to what they do on a day-to-day basis. Forward, yes. And you need to be one forward of you. Stacked. And you need to be hidden. By default. Oh, don't you love user interface? So we're going to do something exciting and do drag and drop sampling. Well, we are, but we're making the cool user interface at the same time. And why aren't the borders lining up? That looks ugly as sin with weird borders going on. You do not need a background border, sorry. Border size 0. Does that look any better? Yeah. Cool, so turn on sample dropper because we're going to want to drop a sample. I then try and drop something that it will not accept, such as this JPEG file. Boom, unsupported format, try again. 2 seconds it turns off and goes back to our drop sample object. Oh, nice user interface design right there, if I do say so myself. I think that'll do a nice job. I kind of want to get rid of this horrible file naming thing. Can you remove that? Who knows? But what we can also do is obviously drop usable files such as AIFs, and if we drop that, it will just let it drop, tell us the name of the file, and we can then turn off the sample dropper, and it should actually display the sample if we connect up the code correctly. Final step, and then we'll see if this works properly in action. So again, we've got a nice display now telling us when unsupported formats are dropped on. The next final, and if a supported format is dropped on, it opens a gate allowing the file to actually pass through, and that should get loaded into our buffer. So we should be able to close this, close the device quickly, go back into actual Ableton land. We now have a button allowing us to turn on sample dropping. It gives us a little prompt. I can load in a sample, drop it in, and that's what you get when you don't test your code before excitedly Oh no, it will work. If I turn off sample drop, it's loaded in. Maybe whenever we drop a sample on that works, we want it to automatically turn off sample dropping and just take us to the waveform. I quite like that idea actually. But just to double test the other functionality, if we drop on something it doesn't expect, again, let's just go for some stupid file. Unsupported format. Last object. And why does the audio engine seem to only continually want to close when I'm looking at Ableton? That is weird, isn't it? We were fine in Max for ages without the audio engine crapping out. Now as soon as we look at Ableton, the audio engine is going to crap out every few seconds. So I like the idea of when we drop on the sample, we actually want it to, and you can disappear down here as well actually. When we drop on the sample, we want to close the sample view. So when you actually get a sample that is accepted and it's properly loaded and it's loaded into here, that would be a good sign. So actually we're going to take down here when the sample is correctly loaded. So yeah, whenever you try and load a sample into buffer, when it is loaded properly, it bangs out of the right outlet. What happens out the left outlet? Mouse editing, well, that's going to screw that. So the first thing we want to do is actually do the proper codey stuff. But after we've done the codey stuff, we're going to make it set that to off and hide it. So we'll move you down a bit. New prepend set. Because we need to send a prepend set message to turn itself off. And let's make a tiny bit more space because we'll send the whole one bang up here. And when it gets a bang, what is it going to do? It's going to set the sample user interface object to off. And I mean, that won't fuck around with MIDI mapping too much because, again, as I've talked about in previous videos, you generally don't want code within a device setting user interface objects that are MIDI mapped or automated, because the code updating that device will break, could mess with a controller or break automation and make the automation appear grayed out. But who the hell is going to be MIDI mapping sample drop to a controller when you've got to drop it with your mouse anyway? So we could actually even disable MIDI mapping on that just to make sure that never happens. But yes, so we want to send it to the actual code in here to make them hidden. Oh, let's make this kind of clear, in fact. Screw you, objects. There. You here. You come around here. Tidy up this cable with Command Y. Get you out of the way. You need to now come all the way up here. And now I'm going to use Command Shift Y to make you do the little loopy mabob. Oh, that's a horrible way. Let's go this way. That makes sense, actually. Move you up a bit. Tidy, tidy, tidy. Boom. Now, if I'm correct, if I drag a sample into here, it should remove the sample drop message and just show me the sample. Boom. Nice work. And then again, if we want to, we can turn on sample drop. And if we try and drop in something pointless, that's not going to work. Unsupported format, try again. Takes us back to our drop sample message. And still telling us the name of the sample it couldn't use. I wish I could get rid of that. There must be a way somewhere. Or do we want it to tell us what sample we've loaded? No, we don't, because we've dropped it on. Of course we know what sample we've tried to load. We know it's worked. Let's figure out how to get rid of that one last thing I do not like the look of. And then this will actually be pretty well functioning. Bit of code. Border color focus, text color. But there's another weird bit of text hanging around in a different color. And I think it's telling me there's actually just no way to get rid of that, because it appears in a different shade of grey, so I thought there might be an option to turn that off. There's not. Well, anyway, What we had relatively quickly, what we've managed to program is a sample dropper. That's working with the Granular Synth and correctly making the code work. And we added a little bit more fancy business here where we displayed some nice user interface messages and made it nice to actually use. So again, we'll just run through that quickly. We now have, above the sample viewer over here, clear sample. That's just actually useful for when you're recording into it, or maybe just wiping the buffer for some reason. But what we can actually do is turn on sample drop mode. That makes the live.drop object unhidden, which is stunning. In the inspector, there's an attribute for making objects hidden when they're in presentation mode, which is what this is when you're viewing a device in the device tray with presentation mode turned on. We can turn it on. It makes the sample dropper visible. We can then drop AIF or WAV files into it. As soon as I let go of this sample, oh, and also, yeah, just to prove you again, you can drop them from the browser. You can drop them from your operating system file explorer, and you can even drop them from clips, maybe clips that you've been recording into other tracks or whatever. Drag it on top of the sample dropper. As soon as we let go and drop it, when the sample is loaded, it actually turns off sample drop mode, makes the waveform visible to us. Nice. Backup behavior, because we've done that fancy bit of coding, if we drop in a file that isn't supported, we even nicely get a little warning message that lasts for 2 seconds and then tells us to try again. Tells us to try again and then switches back to sample drop mode. We could then drop in a correct file. We'll be out of sample drop mode. And the sample is loaded in here, which makes me pretty confident it should work here. Nice. I know that sample's actually very long. It might be useful to have some information on how long the sample you've loaded up is, because you might actually want to sync the scan to play for that length. We need to add something into our LFO scan code where the rate could automatically be set to the length of the sample you've loaded in, because this sample is actually very long. So we'd probably want a really short time. Weird old sample from the film I can't even remember the name of for now. Who knows why I've got that. You can load in loads of different files though. You can even, obviously the nice thing with live drop as well is if you've got any live packs are kind of limited in that I mean they're great, but the files themselves have some kind of protection on most of the time, if I remember correctly. God, it's been so long since I've used these samples in a pack. What? Breakbeat? There's definitely some breakbeats in here. Why not? Oh, turn on sample drop mode. Drop in our sample. Ah. That's giving it a really weird shuffle with the envelope. Oh, time stretching sample loading stuff is working good. And I think that sample dropping interface is actually quite nice. basically when the sample drop is off, we can still, I don't think we've really, or there's any particular need to mess around with switching the buffer over any more than this. For example, when we could still have different record things coming in that are recording on top of this example and kind of messing around with it. I don't think I really want to do too much switching in between a kind of live mode and a sample drop mode. I think this may be simple enough. You just turn on sample drop mode. It allows you to drop the sample in. You could still record over the top of it if you wanted to, or you could clear the sample out. And clearing that sample should clear the waveform. Maybe that's not working properly. And then we'd want to be able to switch back into maybe live recording mode at different times and mess around with that as well. It seems like pressing it did actually clear the sample. Why didn't it clear it when I clicked it? It seemed like it didn't. Is that just me? Oh, I just sent the message clear with nothing actually there. Well, that's why it's not going to do anything. We need to actually have a clear button like that. So when I click it, it clears it. That switches us back to clearing the sample, and then you can start recording in again. The only issue there being every time we load a sample in, the sample size gets updated. Due to what? Why the hell is this here? Meh. Bye. Whenever we drop a sample in, we get information from the sample record, and we update the sample size, which updates the granular engine and allows it to work properly. What we probably want to do though is, let's say we want to actually start recording into it again. We turn off sample drop mode, we clear the buffer out of our loaded sample. We need a way to then update the size of the buffer, so we are not continually stuck with the buffer size of whatever sample we just loaded in. So we need a kind of user interface way to do that. So what we're probably going to do is have another buffer object somewhere up here. I need to actually tidy up this kind of code into different sections at some point, but God, it'll do for now. With the buffer object, you can send it messages to change the length of the amount of space in RAM it is saving for you to write into. And you can do that in samples or milliseconds. If you're doing wavetables or something like that, you might be operating in samples more often, but we are just doing longer form kind of samples, so we are going to operate in milliseconds, which is a lot better. I've already used an attribute at the end of the sample, you might be able to see here, just to set the default size to 5000. We can always update that attribute at any time by sending the message size followed by a number of milliseconds. You can also send the set size message as well. There seems to be two. Probably this set size message existed before attributes were a thing in Ableton. Sorry, Max. So we're just going to have the message size, and we're going to be able to set the size of the sample. We're going to need another pair of these as well. Again, duplicating the objects, you might think, oh, you got so many of the same object, why do you keep duplicating it? You can have more of these buffer objects in different places around your code where it makes sense in the flow of the code to be able to view it. I don't think having two buffer objects with the same name is messing up making more code or anything like that. It's fine. If you need, don't just have one info object somewhere in your patch, as far as I know, and be trying to send it messages for everywhere with sends and stuff like that. You can just copy it, give it the same name, and use it in your code as needed where it makes sense in the flow of the code to help with readability and being able to copy the code to other devices. So we're again going to have a update size option. We probably want some kind of live.nombox interface for this. We want I'm going to deal with labeling these things later because it's hella boring, but for now we are going to want it to be millisecond format. I mean, you wouldn't want to set the sample. I mean, in this example, setting really, really low millisecond values is going to be kind of pointless. Would you ever even want to be able to go below a second? I mean, you could. I mean, why the hell not? Let's just make it go from 1 millisecond, which is kind of an entirely useless thing, but It's a fun thing with Macs. You can make things be stupid lengths that make no sense to most people in terms of the device anyway. Someone will probably find a weird way to use it though, and thank you for having that weird option in it. Maximum length 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Maybe someone's going to do some really weird performance with this device one day where they're going to have a 10-minute performance, and throughout the 10-minute performance this device is calling back material from 5 minutes ago and granulating it. Who knows? Why not? We can allow them to do that with our silly Max programming that allows us to program really long lengths that you would not find in an average device. One thing I need to work out though is how many milliseconds are in 10 minutes. So a second is 1,000 milliseconds. 1,000 times 60 gives us a minute. Yeah, brain, that makes sense. So a minute is 60,000 milliseconds. Times that by 10. That should be how many milliseconds are in 10 minutes. Maybe. So what if I make this be between 1 millisecond. Oh god, 1 millisecond and 60,000. Oh. Boom. So you should even be able to drag this up into the above the seconds. Oh, it does not have a nice minutes range at all, does it? Live, why would you do this to me? It works, it does milliseconds, then it switches to seconds, and then it does nothing when you go above 60 seconds. I thought surely this would switch to showing like 1M, 2Ms, maybe even go up to hours, but no, it does not. So that's not going to be such a nice interface for someone, but in a way that's what Ableton's given us, unfortunately, unless there's a way to change it to display minutes and hours as well. I do not think there is. That is a feature request to submit. This still outputs milliseconds, which is what we need. It just means if someone decides they want to do something for a minute, they are going to have to type in, you know, you might type 1,000 milliseconds, you'd get a second, and you'd think, great. You'd think 10 seconds? Yeah. 1 minute, you'd need to type 60,000. 10 minutes, you'd need to type. So people would just be needing to do some maths in their heads to learn about the difference between milliseconds and seconds and stuff, but they'll just have to deal with that for now. Plug that in to the size command, and now whenever we mess with this, we are going to edit the size. We are going to give it a default value of 5,000. That's already defaulted here. But in the device, we will give it that anyway, so it updates to the right value whenever we open up this device. User interface. Live.comment to do something. Sample size. Size. We've already got a sample thing. We're going to put it there. We're going to say size. That is going to be our bit of code that deals with that. Well, sorry, our little user interface thing that highlights it. And whenever we actually change that, we need it to get the info from the buffer to make sure it properly updates all the code, just like the code is properly updated when we drag a sample in. So, first thing we do is set the actual size using the buffer object. Next thing we do, bang the info to get the info of what the new sample size is, and we set the sample size out the bottom. So if we do a few tests, if I do something like set the sample size to be 1,000 milliseconds, which would be 1 second, first thing that's going to happen is it's going to, using our trigger object, we're defining the flow of information. First thing that's going to happen, we're going to send the size command, size 1,000 to buffer. We should set this to be 1 second long. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to send a bang to the info object, which will get our sample size, update our sample size values, so all of the underlying granular play engine code gets up to date. And you can see properly out here we've been updated with the proper size. And this tiny user interface majig does look like it's now going to a second. Oh, that's incredibly grey. I don't know if you can see that, but I can type in any kind of value. I can even shift this around and it gets a bit weird and doesn't like it, but it can do it. Because if you suddenly change a buffer to being 10 minutes long, it's effectively suddenly got to make that amount of space in your RAM to store 10 minutes of audio. But we can do that now, and yeah, that's I know by default this user interface little, if you double click a buffer you get a little view of the waveform, and we can see we've got 10 spaces. Each one of those is a minute. I lied. Is each one half a minute? Is each one a second? Who knows? Maybe it does some other weird thing. Oh yeah, it's changing size depending on how close I... Oh god, I don't know what it's doing. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that's the correct amount of milliseconds. If it's not, and my maths has gone terribly wrong, tell me. Should be right. Cool, so now we've got a way we can change the sample size to different values when we want to go back to recording and we've stopped using the sample dropper, but we are starting to get to the point where we're running out of space, aren't we? So we're probably going to need to do something like this. Have a nice sample dropper, sample sizer. Is that going to work with everything? Oh, glitchy, 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 glitch, because it's messing around with stuff in RAM. Yeah, that kind of works. And we got the clear button down here as well. I'll shift these over so there's a bit more space for them. Nudge up the sample size. Kind of ugly, but that's going to do for now. Sorry, envelope, you have had to get shrunk down, but we're going to do some messing around, making better envelope shapes probably next week, near when we're finishing the device off. Cool, so now we can load in samples. I want it to tell us the sample size in here when the size updates. Also, I do not want anyone to be able to MIDI map or automate the sample size. Do I want to disable that? I think I do, because whenever you drag this, it triggers something to happen in RAM that kind of lags and glitches out a bit. So I think we actually don't want people to be able to automate that kind of stuff. So if you don't want people to automate any parameters in your Max for Live device, you can select it and look in the inspector window, and right down the bottom you have parameter visibility. And that's where you can select whether that user interface device can be automated and stored. So that means you can automate it and it's saved with the set. Stored only stops it being automated, and I think also with any luck stops it being MIDI mapped, although I think this visible to mapping does visible to mapping only exist? Because you can MIDI map and key map things in native Macs as well as just in Ableton. So maybe we'd kind of want to turn off visibility to mapping to stop it being MIDI mapped. Actually, let's test something. I'm going to set it to stored only. So it should not be automatable and appear in the list of automatable parameters when this device is in Max. But we should. So if I highlight it and I do something like, look at this clip, and I turn on, look at the automation, and I haven't named, this is why you need to name your parameters, otherwise you end up with tons of useless things, you don't know what they mean. Select it, switch over. I mean, technically, are you there? No, you're not. Yeah, I don't think it's actually letting me select that parameter to automate it. Otherwise, it'd appear in here and this value would be not clear. It would be like 5,000 milliseconds or whatever it is. If I try to do something like K, yes, so if I turn on K, it looks like by default, if you make something stored only, it turns off the MIDI mapping as well. So I think if something's automated, it's MIDI mappable. You cannot decouple mapping from automation. I don't think you can have something that's automatable but not MIDI mappable. You can't have something that's MIDI mappable but not automatable, at least not with the native object. You could probably code up something or use layers of user interface objects to allow those things to happen. But by default now, people should not be able to MIDI map and automate this thing, just like they can also not MIDI map or automate storing presets and things like that. We're going to redesign this in a sec anyway, because you can't actually, because we used non-Max for Live objects here for setting the pitches and for setting the pitch probability table, we've ended up with these cannot be automated or MIDI mapped, and I think it'd actually be a lot more fun if you could automate and MIDI map the pitches and the list of probabilities, because you could then design presets using clips or MIDI map them to some faders and have fun with the device. So although we did this nice cool user interface that I quite like, and it's really flexible because you can actually make as many pitches, you can type in as many pitches and get as many faders as you like and stuff like that, just in terms of actual native Ableton usability, not so great because you can't MIDI map it and stuff like that. So we'll change that in a sec, but we're for now good. Sample size, not automatable or mappable, which should stop someone accidentally MIDI mapping or automating it and causing weird spikes and glitches when you change this to a very large number and it does something with the RAM. Sorry. But we want this to update and tell us what the size is whenever something else changes. Do we? Do we want that? We could make that. We could basically make a system where whenever we drop the sample in, it updates and tells us what the sample size is. I think we can manage that relatively simply. And for simplicity's sake, I could put this code down here. Just what the hell, let's chuck it down there for now. Oh, not like that, that's for sure. Could write this on top of the existing objects. Not going to, because I can't be asked. Going to get the sample size. You are going to write the sample size, which I'm pretty sure is a floating point number, because it could be, yeah, it's a decimal / floating point number in programming terms. Update the sample size in the code, and then send a prepend set message to our sample size user interface object, which is displaying what the current size is. So something like that should work as well, to mean that whenever we drag in a sample, turn on sample. So by default, let's set this to be our normal 5 seconds, like we're expecting, and let's imagine we've been doing some recording into the buffer. Need to turn that on for that to happen. Do recording into the buffer like this, recording my voice into the 5-second buffer. Fine. We can then actually drag in a turn on sample drop mode, drag in a breakbeat, boom, and this breakbeat happens to be 4.8 seconds long. So it's also updated our user interface to tell us how long the sample is. I like that. We're going to disable this from being MIDI mapped or automated as well. No one needs to do that to the sample drop, but that's cool. I like that that's now updating to tell us how long the sample size is at the same time. One thing that would be nice, to be fair, is a way where, depending what sample you drop in, it automatically sets the scan time to scan through the sample to the same length, because then you could keep the sample being the same length, I guess. I don't know, we'll faff around with that later. The next thing I want to add to the device is kind of quantized recording and a slightly better way to set the sample size length. So although we just found this new way to set the sample size, I'd like to be able to set the sample size in bars, beats, and units, like we did with our cool LFO, wherever the hell we left that, all the way over here. Our LFO operates not just in hertz, which is another time format, of course, rather than milliseconds. It also operates in bars, beats, and units, so we can set the sync, this LFO, which is controlling the sample play position, we can set it in bars or beats, relative to transport and the global tempo, which is how a lot of people are often working with LFOs rather than in free hertz or milliseconds. You don't want to have a project where you've set the tempo to 174 or something, or even a project where you're automating the tempo maybe for a live set and have to be updating your LFOs in milliseconds and hertz, trying to work out how many milliseconds or hertz one bar is in the tempo of 174, and then halfway through a set it's actually at 130 or something. That's why you have tempo relative formats. And so I'd like to be able to do something, whereas as well as I can load in samples now and stuff like that, that's cool. This again is generally still a live recording style device. Slight break. This week the stream is accompanied by beer, because it's actually nice weather outside and we're going to sit outside afterwards and finish this beer. Arbor 00, thoroughly recommended local Bristol beer. And I think at the minute you can even go to Arbor Brewery and pick up beer on the weekends, which is paying. But this 001 is particularly well tasty, and I'm getting a bit thirsty, so need some beer before we carry on. And hay fever is murdering me again, which is making me sniffle and a weird throat load, so sorry if it sounds weird on the stream. Wow, that is a terribly poured pint. Well done. My time working in a pub was clearly for nothing. Fucking hell, that was good. Right. Ramble. Recording samples. You also... Dropping on samples, changing the sample length in milliseconds is all cool. That's pretty free. That's pretty fun. But, again, live recording, style device, audio effect kind of thing is our main purpose with this device anyway, for now, before we add MIDI input and stuff like that. So, we've already set up the scanning and the syncing. Scanning to be kind of quantized, so we can scan through the sample at a tempo relative format. One thing I think we also want to be able to do is set the recording, or the length of the recording, to be a specific number of bars. So that should allow us to do stuff like set the buffer size to be 2 bars of whatever our current tempo is, and we can trigger the record button, or automate the record button, and as well as when we set the sample size, we can set it in number of bars at the current tempo. We would also then be able to trigger record and have it start recording on the downbeat of the bar, and you wouldn't really need it to stop recording because you'd be setting the record length separately. But I like the idea of this quantized recording option. It'd allow you to be using this for live performances and stuff, and make sure you're exactly recording 2 bars of audio, and then you can sync and scan through those 2 bars exactly using the scan function. So as well as setting the length of the buffer in bars or beats at the current tempo, we also want to use the record function to allow it to only start the recording quantized to the downbeat. So, ways you can program that. First things first, ways to set the sample size in bars, beats and units rather than milliseconds. We currently just have one control, just operating in milliseconds, setting the size. The buffer object, as far as I know, especially for size at least, does not have any weird tempo relative capabilities for sending messages. It always wants to receive messages in milliseconds. So we're going to need to use a translate object, which can translate between different time formats. And we are going to want to translate between bars, beats, units. I think we can just write that as BBU, and milliseconds. Let's see if this works. And at our current tempo of 130.17, oh, that is, don't know why the hell it, maybe because I dragged in a sample. Live sometimes does that on the first project, but we should be able to write in a number of bars. Say we write in 1 bar, 0 beats, 0 units, and if we're at 120 BPM, it should spit out 2000 milliseconds. Yeah, because 120, if every beat is, 120 is 1 bar every, oh god, no, today's not a day for maths. I'm already drinking now, so no more stupid maths, but for some reason I know 1 bar at 120 BPM is 2 seconds. Yeah, 120 BPM, that means 1 beat is every half a second. Come on, someone who knows actual can bother to do maths. Tell me the answer if I'm wrong. But that makes sense to me. So using a translate object, we can actually enter in a number of bars, beats and units and get out the bottom what that is in milliseconds, which would allow us to set our sample size to be a good size in terms of tempo relative time formats rather than just in seconds. Let's make a bit of space down here. So we're also going to want some kind of user interface way to enter times, not just in our single millisecond or minutes, millisecond, seconds or minutes box. We're going to want a nice other way to enter times in bars, beats and units. And so you have this kind of thing in, for instance, audio clips, where you've got these 3 box setups. And here you've got bars, beats, they work in bars, beats and 16ths in Ableton, I forgot about that. But we'd probably want to mimic the functionality of that. We'd want to have a 3 box setup where we can set the number of bars, beats, and maybe we'd like to operate in 16ths rather than ticks, which is this weird time format. Each beat is like 480 ticks or something, technically, in weird music programming jargony stuff. So let's make a few num boxes. We're going to have one for the number of bars. Ugh. And how do they look in the live user interface? In the live user interface, the numbers align to the right. So let's match up the live user interface to make it obvious to people what's going on. And we're going to do that by justifying the text to the right. Text justification, right. So the idea is we're going to mimic existing Ableton user interface looks, so people see these and go, oh yeah, I've already seen those in a clip, whatever, I understand what's going on. Going to use the join 3 object to join these objects together. We could also just use a pack object, basically a join. So this is 3 individual user interface objects, but obviously we want them to output as one list: bars, beats, and units. Although technically PBU is bars, beats, and ticks. Why are they called units? It'd be lovely if the units were 16ths, weren't they? Can they be 16ths, or is it always this horrible ticks format? We'll find out. Anyway, joins 3 things together and allows them just to output as one list, just like that. All of these need to be just integers, though. You cannot have floating point values of a tick. And to make sure that happens, we're going to convert them all to ints by just running them through a int object. We won't do that. You may have noticed just there I shied away from. If you look at a live.num box in the inspector and go to its parameter mode, you can set its data type between float, int, and innum or enumerated list. That changes the way the automation looks in Live's automation mode. You may have seen before, when you select different parameters, the way the automation looks changes. For buttons, obviously, you just have this on-off, up-down toggle. It's either on, it goes off, you just get a harsh, immediate line. If you have a floating point value, say you're going to want to edit the tempo, you get this smooth line that you can drag and change. You can obviously add curves to and things like that. If you select an integer, you get a slightly different automation interface when you're designing a Max for Live device. An example of that would be in the beat repeat, I think. If you try and automate stuff like the interval, see, we've got this different interface now. This is what's called the integer automation interface. You get a grid and you kind of have to deal with it like that, and it looks, yeah, it's got this gridded interface when you're dealing with an integer rather than a floating point. Relatively few instances where I think that's a useful difference. But yes, generally when you're changing an integer, obviously the beat repeat, for instance, doesn't slide between 1.4, 1.2 and whatever. It just jumps straight between those values, which makes sense. When you've got a floating point interface, the kind of idea is it's showing you that although you've selected 120 and 168, it's slowly going at every possible value in between those two. Anyway, that's why in a Max for Live device, when you are designing the user interface and designing using these Max for Live objects, you can set their data types to different things, such as integer, float, or enumerated list. But for now, I'm just going to stick in float land rather than going to integers, and I'm just going to convert them to integers by shoving a I object after them, which should mean they never output floating point numbers. So now if I do this, correct me if I'm wrong, they should now not have decimal points at the end. Anyway, we can now type in a number of beats, a number of bars, and a number of units, although I have a feeling this is in ugly-ass ticks rather than 16th notes, so we might even need to do some further math to convert 16th notes to ticks. We'll worry about that later. Anyway, this is turned in a list. The other thing to note with join is, by default, as with many objects in Max, you have what's called cold inlets, and you have what's called hot inlets. By default with join, the leftmost inlet is the warm inlet, the others are cold. So if I edit these values here, nothing actually gets passed down and output until I change something running into the hot inlet. Not useful in this case, because we might actually just be working with 0 bars and just changing, saying I just want to record for a certain number of beats. So what we're going to want to do is a attribute called triggers, which allows us to set different inputs to be hot or cold, and by setting the message -1, attribute triggers, so you can make different ones of these the hot inlet. If I type 2, for example, now the second, so that's 0, 1, 2, the second inlet's hot. You can see hopefully the others have become light blue, cold. The hot one is kind of this orangey red. If you actually set -1, every inlet is hot. So now any change to any of these number boxes will output the actual value. The other thing, if I remember correctly, when we're working in here, is if I actually go up above 4, it snaps and takes us back down to 1 here and updates the bar there. It would require a fair bit of fancy coding for us to mess around and make this work quite properly, where whenever this number goes to 4, it snaps back to 1, this goes to 5. I think same here for 16th, so if I go, as I mess around in the 1 to 4 16th notes, which are within a beat, it's upping the number box here to increase the beat, and it's increasing the bars as well. Definitely possible. You'd basically just have a kind of, if number goes above 4, increase this one, wrap yourself back to 1 Can we be bothered to code that right now in the remaining half an hour? Maybe not. Let's focus on a few other important things first, and then we'll worry about this later. Oh, and looks like if you actually set this to a hard number, it will overwrite these. So if I set you to 2 and 3 for some reason, if I actually type 4 here, it'll set you... Okay. So there's even some other code going on in the live user interface that means when you update certain of these number boxes, it actually resets the other numbers. So that'd be another bit of code. If you wanted to totally mimic this user interface that exists in Ableton and put that in for a Max for Live device, you'd probably need to do a bit of extra coding to make sure all the numbers updated correctly as expected. Does the same thing happen for here? No. Okay, well if it doesn't happen in all of them, we're going to get away with it. Oh no, as soon as you go above 4. And if I'm correct actually, because that should take, the beats should take into account the time signature. So if we're actually in 7/4, we should be allowed to go all the way up to 7 before the bar increases. No, what? 3 beats in 7? Oh, because the sample's in 4. Yeah, sorry. Change the sample length. The sample to actually 7. And now this operates in the current signature. Yeah, it goes all the way up to 7. So if you wanted to totally mimic this user interface, you'd actually need to get information from the live API on what the current time signature is, and you'd need to make your user interface boxes allow that many beats before snapping upwards to a bar. If you were doing it in bars, beats and 16ths, you'd even need to know about the whatever the hell the second number in a time signature is called. I've forgotten already. The denominator? Is it like the same as divisions? You got the denominator in the other one. Can't remember. I'm going to stop rambling. We're not going to do that much fancy stuff. We just want a way where we can set the time in bars, beats and units in an ugly half-assed way for now. Point being, I should be able to use these user interface objects to set a number of bars, beats and units, which will update this code and update all the code below. So I should be able to set our record buffer not just in terms of milliseconds, but if we were working in a nice synchronized way with the live transport, I could say I want this to be 1 bar long. And what the hell? We're in 7, that's why. Not 127 in 7/4, but 120 in... Ooh, as we even change the time signature, it updated. Is that correct? So this currently says, does translate work in real time? That's interesting. So we've set our buffer size to be 1 bar at 1 bar at 120 BPM, because the main global transport of live 120 BPM. We want our sample to be 1 bar long. 2000 milliseconds is a number of milliseconds in 1 bar of 120. But if we actually changed our time signature to be 7/4, ooh, in real time, Translate has correctly worked out that 1 bar of 7/4 at 120 BPM is actually 3500 milliseconds. So it would update automatically when we change this. That could be good or bad. Let's see what happens in real time. If we set again, we're currently working in time synchronized, tempo synchronized times rather than in milliseconds to seconds. We're working in bars, beats and 16ths or units. 1 bar of 120 BPM, 2000 milliseconds. If we actually decided to switch it up to 140, yeah, it's now calculated what 1 bar at 140 is and output that. That's kind of clever. I didn't realize Transport did that by default. It could also be bad, because what might happen is if we say automated a tempo rise in a live project with this device, it would be automatically outputting all of these values and updating the length of our buffer in real time, which might cause some issues. So, but anyway, let's leave it how it is for now, but we're going to want to probably change that. We don't want it to be quickly changing the time as you're doing tempo edits, because it's going to clear the buffer and load more RAM and stuff like this, it's going to cause issues. Basically, we'd probably want to have a button to turn it to make it happen once. Anyway, we are going to want another live.txt anyway, which is a button, and we're going to want to switch between defining the record buffer length in milliseconds or in tempo relative format. And we're going to call that, because I cannot be bothered to think of a different word and because it's what we've used in other bits of the device, we're going to call it sync for now. When we are in sync off mode, we're going to be free. We're going to be free from tempo synchronized stuff. We're going to have 2 and we're going to have 1. So 2 outlets. Okay, I'm wrong again. We're going to have a switch, of course, and it's going to be 2 and 1. When sync is set to on, and we're going to need a select object in here as well. Ramble, ramble, ramble. We want to be able to switch between the buffer size, the sample size, being in milliseconds or being in a tempo relative format. So we have a sync button on and off. When we turn sync on, we're in time relative format. When we turn it off, we're in milliseconds. We're free from whatever live's global tempo is. When we do turn it on, we want to update the switch so it correctly moves to the correct inlet. So when sync is on, we should be in... when sync is on, this inlet should be open, this inlet should be closed. When sync is off, this inlet should be closed, this inlet should be open. That works. So that would run into here. This would run into here. The other thing is when you switch between them, you want to get their previous values as they were. So when you are off, we want to do one thing. When you are on, we want to do another thing. So we'll add in a little bit of select code here as well. When you are off, I want to output your value, which I'm pretty sure I can do just by sending you a bang. Yes, I can. Like that. When you are... Oh, Jesus. What is all of this? When you are in sync mode, I want to output all 3 of you, but I do not want it to happen in such an ugly way. So, if I send join a bang, what happens? I reckon if I send join a bang, it outputs the current list. Boom. Cool. So in that case, what we're actually going to do is just bang our join message, which it turns out will actually output all of the current list anyway. So first you will open the correct outlet of the gate, then you will bang what the current value is. So actually, as we switch between being synced and unsynced, we should switch between 5 seconds as we are now unsynced, and then we should sync to whatever 1 bar at 120 BPM is, which we happen to know is 2000 milliseconds. So there we go. We can now switch between the buffer size being in a free Hertz format and being in a synced bar beats unit format, and it correctly opens and closes the switch and outputs the value. Part of the reason we've had to add this switch is because we found out that the translate object actually outputs values whenever you change the tempo or the time signature. So if we didn't have a gate there, we could be in unsynced mode, and if we accidentally were in unsynced mode where we just want to be using the millisecond value, unsynced mode should be using the millisecond value, but if we actually change the tempo, this translate object would output a value and overwrite this one, messing up our buffer size and stuff. So that's partly why I added the gate in, and I've just added this sync with the select and the bangs to make sure when we switch between syncs, it bangs these current objects and sets the buffer size to the correct value. Next thing we'd want to do again is our old friend hidden. I think what we probably want to happen is to have our sync button be in the user interface, and we also want our bars, beats and units objects to be in the user interface. I'm going to grab you all over here, and I'm going to try and find a way. Oh god, I do not want to be able to automate sample size or whatever this is automating. Sample drop, we should not be able to automate you. Sample drop, stored only, do not allow you to automate that. Stored only, sync mode, you can automate that for now. User interface squish, yet again, let's shrink down envelope, I reckon. Put you down here, this is going to save us some space, I reckon. It's going to make things hella ugly, but we will tidy them up at some point in the future. Let's get the envelope out of the way. Let's drag you down a bit. We're going to have sample drop as an option. Clear as a nice, slightly larger option. We're going to have sync over here as well. And what we want to do is have you switch between displaying this or displaying our nice bars, beats and units display instead, which would live in the same space, but obviously we want to use the old hidden trick. So we need another option coming out of here, and first thing you do is you open the gate, you send through the number and do something actually useful, and next up you send, we're going to need a load more space here again, aren't we? Thank you. You are going to send, what one comes on? When sync is on, you want to hide. Boom. That one works without any faffing around. Shift you all up again. Oh, I love that I discovered that a few videos ago. You also want another hidden command, but this one needs to be inverted before it hits it. So we use the old multiply by 1, but inverted, so 1, sorry, not multiply, minus. So 1 minus the number, that hides all of these. And with any luck in the user interface, that should result in something like that. And by default, I want you to be sync mode to be off, which means that all of you should be hidden by default. So now we should also have a way to, oh Jesus, what did I do? So by default, you should definitely be visible. The milliseconds needs to be visible by default. I hope I didn't mess that up. Hide unlock off by default. You should be on, you should get inverted. Let's test it works. When sync mode is on, we switch to bars, beats and units. When sync mode is off, we switch off of bars, beats and units. And each of those times the sample size should be updating correctly. The only weird thing I think about updating a sample buffer, I think, is potentially, am I correct in thinking it would also wipe the buffer? It may also wipe the buffer. So if we did something like drop a sample on here, and now it's updated to say this current sample we've dropped on is 29.5 seconds long. If I did something like set this to be 1 minute long, no 5 seconds long, will it update the length and just show us the first 5 seconds of the sample, or will it totally wipe the sample? It totally wipes the sample. That's good to know. Either way, there probably would be a fancy way of getting around this whereby you could resize the buffer. It would copy the existing buffer into a second buffer. It would then change that buffer's size, and then it would load just the initial 5 seconds of the previous buffer into the new buffer's first 5 seconds. That'd be pretty fancy and cool. But yeah, because otherwise the issue we're going to get into slightly is we could be recording in samples or dragging in samples. And when we drop them in, if we did something like, because at the minute we're in sync mode and Translate automatically outputs the value at the current tempo, if we did something like change just the tempo by 1 BPM, it would wipe the entire sample inside the buffer, which is not really acceptable or usable. Not really usable in the device. So what we'd probably need to happen is we need to stop Translate from outputting values continuously. We only want it to output when we actually change these values. Otherwise, any changes to the time signature or tempo are going to wipe the sample. So we need some kind of gating system there, whereby whenever we change a value here, you open up the gate, send through the value, and then close it to make sure Translate isn't deleting our buffer at random times. And we'd probably want a little display to pop up here and tell us what tempo we were at when we last set this value. So that would be something fancy to add in. I think we're going to have to dive into some live API stuff here for the first time. I did not think we'd do this today, but we're going to do it to make this tempo setting system even fancier. What we're going to do. So as I mentioned, it turns out Translate, the object that translates between 2 different time measurements, outputs continuously whenever you change tempo relative time formats. You could translate between hertz and milliseconds, in which case it's not going to output random stuff because hertz and milliseconds are always the same. Bars, beats and units, or note values, are tempo relative and they change depending what BPM you're in, or in terms of, actually both of them change as well depending what time signature you're in, because 1 bar at 7/4 is a different time, different length of milliseconds to 1 bar at 4/4. So we don't want Translate updating whenever we change the tempo or automate the tempo in live to wipe our buffer and delete our sample. Say you'd recorded in a really nice sample take and you thought, oh, I'm just going to change this track a little bit, I'm just going to make this track be at 140, and it just deletes your whole sample. Not good. So we're going to want to limit that in some way. We're going to want to stop this outputting. We're going to only want it to output when we change one of these values. The way to do that would be to add in a simple gating mechanism. So part 1 in stopping Translate doing stupid stuff is to add in an extra gate like this. Translate goes into gate. Gate by default is turned off. Stopping messages pass through. When a value here changes, we want, again with trigger you've kind of got to write in reverse order because we're defining the order events are going to happen, but events in Max happen from right to left, and when you type stuff in, or generally write in English, you write in left to right. So we kind of need to do a little bit of thinking here. The last thing we want to do is close the gate, we want to pass through the value, which is a list of 3 numbers. First thing we want to do is open the gate. So this trigger here is going to define a sequence of 3 events we want to happen to allow us to pass on this value and then not pass on any further objects to translate when it updates. Aha! Screw you. Screw this gating thing. Why didn't I think of this before? Translate has an object, has an attribute to allow it to automatically do this stuff anyway, because Max is clever, and I only just thought of that after I'd started programming it. So screw all that code I just talked about and what we were doing. Translate the translate object has some attributes that do this stuff already. Input format BBU, that's what we want. Output format milliseconds is what we want. Mode interval sets the mode for time values. The translate can output time values in either position relative. Ooh, position relative or time. Yeah, we want to be interval. Listen to tempo changes. We want that to be off. We do not want you to be outputting extra values whenever tempo changes or whenever time signature changes. Hopefully, listen to tempo change applies to time signature change as well. So by adding a hard-coded attribute of listen 0, it should no longer output values when I change tempo. So for example, if I go over here, fiddle with the tempo in Ableton, it's outputted jack. If I change the time signature, it's outputted jack. If I turn listen to on by setting it to 1 and I output times tempo, it's still outputted nothing, which is weird. Because I haven't set a default value to set you to. Yes, so if I set you to 1, it's tempo. So I've set translate to be 1, 0, 0. I can now mess with tempo. It outputs a new value each time. I mess with the tempo. Am I correct? Set you to 120, should be 2000. Yes, if I delete you and change the time signature to 7 instead, translate outputs that value with listen turned on, which is its default functionality. If I set listen to 0, I set it to translate from 1 bar to milliseconds, which it outputted when I sent it in 1 bar. But now if I clear this value here and I go over here and change the time signature to 44, hopefully you won't output a value. Yes, you haven't output a value. And I can change the tempo to say 140 or 150, and you have an output value. Good, that saves us on some gate coding. Should have thought that before I started explaining the gate, but well, listen mode 0, this isn't going to faff around and interrupt and mess with our code. That means we could even disable this switch if we wanted, to be fair, because we don't even care about this anymore. We can just run these both hard into this bit of code here and not faff around with the gate. We've already done it now though, so screw it. First part was sorting out that translate thing. Next thing is whenever one of these values changes, so basically we're working here defining the recording size in tempo relative format, a bar of what currently is 140 BPM. If we update the tempo in Ableton or the signature, time signature, it will not update the record of the buffer and delete the material within it. That's fine. That kind of makes sense. I think that's the better behavior. But if you messed around at 120 and set a sample size and you were thinking, okay, the sample's at 120, later on in a project or a gig you shift over to being at 150, 160 BPM, the sample size in here is still 1 bar at 120, you might forget that and be thinking, why the hell is this sample being weird? It's not quite the right speed, yada yada. So we want a nice way where it knows what tempo we were at when we set the sample size. So we want to get information from Ableton of what the current tempo is. I cannot remember if we can do that with the transport object or if we need to use the API to do that. I'm hoping we can do that just with the transport object, and we can get into live API stuff in another video or another series. If I just use the transport object, which as you may have guessed allows us to get information from the transport, does it automatically tell me what the current tempo is? It definitely knows what the current tempo is. By default, obviously, it's linked to the live tempo. If I change the tempo here, it outputs what the tempo is. Boom. No API shit needed. Whenever I change the tempo, like translate with its default auto listen behavior, transport is outputting what the current tempo is when I want to know. Can I actually change the tempo in this way? If I set this, if I send the message 120, do you do anything? If I send the message tempo 120, I thought you need to use the API to do that. Maybe you don't. Tempo 120. Oh, it doesn't work. Yeah, that's fine. That makes sense. You can't set the tempo this way in Max. You need to use the API to do it. But we can get information on the tempo from Max, which is all we currently need to do. So I am actually kind of fine with that. But that does mean transport object is going to output the tempo we are currently at out of here. That is great. I think I can even send it a bang and it actually reports the current state. That is actually even better. So if I look here for tempo, if I bang this object, it should output what the current tempo is. Boom. Yeah, we're currently at 148. If I switch to 120, it'll probably output 120. It does, but I could also bang it to get it again. Bang. Oop, bang. Whee. So what I want to happen now, whenever this list gets changed, I'm going to make a trigger object to define a flow of data again. Whenever bars, beats, or what's currently ticks but should be 16th notes, changes, the list gets output at the bottom of here. First it gets output out the right outlet, then out the left. Whenever that happens, I want to bang the transport object and find out what the current tempo is. And I want to put that tempo up here. This is where we are going to need the gate thing we nearly did, because again, this object actually by default outputs what the tempo is all the time, and we've run out of space. Again, we're going to need to go all the way over here somewhere now to get space for this bit of code. I'm going to shrink you down a bit for a sec and do some quick. What is this patch looking like in the macro view? It's looking ugly as hell. Things all over the place. What are they doing? God, we need to tidy this up one day. Let's chuck all of you way down here. We have jumbled code up here, but it's something to do with an audio analyzer and a sample player. So that is all the audio analyzer code, if I'm correct. And the sample engine is underneath it. And here we have our pitch kind of code. Some other random pitch bit of code we never finished off. Yeah, you can go and live down there next to pitch, to be fair. Your kind of user interface pitchy stuff. The LFO. Sample drop stuff, you need to live near the sample. That makes sense. You can still be here. LFO, you can now come way over here. And you, my little handy bang object that allows me to drag objects down, you need to go live way down here now. Job done. Patch tidied a tiny bit. You can get out of my way a little bit, actually. Thank you. Cool, code. Tidied up a tiny bit. Nicely done. We'll need to tidy this up properly one day, but screw it, that'll do for now. Make some big comments about what's where. It's always a handy thing to do, but we've got loads more space now, which we won't need that much of anyway to do the current job. Where we were at. Transport outputs a value whenever you change the tempo. As far as I can tell, there's no way to turn the listen attribute off for transport. There's no turn listen mode off, so it looks like it will always output the tempo whenever it changes. We just want to get the tempo once. and then we want to ignore it. So we're going to use a gate like we were previously just setting up. We're going to set up a trigger object, and the flow is in reverse order, going to be close the gate, get the value, open the gate. So in other words, the actual value, the actual flow in terms of in the right order would be, first of all, open this gate so values will pass through. Next thing you do, bang the transport object to get the current tempo, send it into the gated input. Next thing you do, close the gate. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's going to get what the current BPM is whenever we make a change here. So whenever I change any of these three boxes and the value gets output out here, you should see a bang here signifying that it's going to be output. If I change the tempo, we should not see the output. The output would come out of the transport object here, but due to the gate and the way it's closing every time after we change a number here, we shouldn't see it. So I can fiddle around with this all I like. We can see the tempo here, but it hasn't actually got passed through to mess with our code. Cool. Next thing you want to do, I'm going to have a little live dot comment object up here to set the value that is in a comment object. I'm pretty sure you send it the set message. Yes, set displays a message. So we're going to set new prepend set. So we're going to send the live comment object the message or the function or the command set, and set followed by a number sets that value, and in this case it's going to set it to tempo of 120. Boom. We're actually going to increase the size of that in case the tempo goes weird, but it should never get more than that. Going to put that into the user interface, and we're going to put that next to the bars, beats and units like that. And we also want that to be hidden when we are not working tempo relative terms. Oh, that is ugly cabling I don't like. Let's see if I can. God, that's also ugly as hell. It'll have to do. Now we also have that only showing when you're hidden. By default you need to be hidden because we are synced turned off by default. Now we should have a situation where we turn sync off. We can see the sample at the current sample size we've set. I turn sync on, I can see the current tempo at the value we've set yourself to. So if I'm in sync mode and I set the sample size to be 2 bars and I record into those 2 bars with my microphone like this, something very weird happened there actually, didn't it? Yellow, check, 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 check. Yellow, check, check, check. Something weird is going on. You can probably see there, definitely. Is the record size not being updated? The record should always record the right amount into the buffer though, surely. The idea generally is though, we should be able to change the size here and see how long that sample is in terms of beats, bars and units at the tempo it was when we currently set it. But if I then did something like change the tempo up here, it is not by default going to edit the tempo and the length of our sample and clear it out. So we can see we are still at 2 bars at 120 BPM. Hopefully that makes sense. I could change it though, and then it would switch to showing us we are at 1 bar at 140, which is our new current tempo when we set the sample size. For some reason though, we should see, yeah, that is all kinds of balked up, isn't it? When I record into the buffer at 1 bar at 140 BPM, the record playhead stopping like here. It's continuing to record afterwards. What the hell is going on? Sounding very weird. It looks like we are correctly setting the buffer size. Because if I've set a buffer... Where the hell are we in this patch? If I've set a buffer to be 1 bar at 140 BPM, that would be... how many milliseconds? Oh, some horrible number of milliseconds. That means this buffer should be that many milliseconds. Yes, the buffer, the sample, is 1 bar at 140 BPM. And record, I thought record just defaulted to going to the start point and the end point. Why would record not do that? So by default, when I record, I should be recording for the correct length of time, yeah? Surely? How would record not... Don't tell me every time I change the BPM I need to reset the record to look at the correct buffer. Do I need to do that? That'd be horribly shit if I did. Because I have a feeling, again, if I juggle the record on, you're doing something really stupid. I reckon I might need to do that. It's not good, but the record object, you can tell it which object you want it to record into. Which buffer it is linked to, sorry. If we look at the help file, we can set, if you want to record to a certain buffer, you say set buffer name. So the message set -- record should tell it to look at the current buffer. I'm hoping that kind of updated it to look at our current buffer. And now if I record into it, will it record properly? Yellow, check, 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 check. Yes, it will. If I do something like change this to be 4 bars long at 140 BPM. What? So you can go longer and it writes the sample in, but if you go shorter, it deletes the sample. Oh my god, there is all kinds of shit going on right now. Well, stuff you learn when you start trying to mess around with buffer sizes. It looks like... it looks like it's kind of resetting the buffer really weirdly when I change the buffer length. Oh, I do not understand that at all. What happens if we're unsynced? If I set this to be 10 seconds long, the sample's been totally wiped. Cool. If I set this to be really long, the sample's been totally wiped. No. There's a tiny bit of information still stuck in that buffer. Oh, mysteries abound. Weird things you did not realize happened or were an issue sometimes pop up like this, as we now know. Oh god, and you can even load samples in stereo. That's one other thing I didn't consider. You can be operating in stereo or not, and you might want to load in and mono both the channels into one. Oh, we're not even going to faff about that. We're running out of time already. Okay. When you mess with the tempo or change the length of the buffer, it looks like I didn't realize, but it will actually keep some of that sample stored in buffer memory outside of its limits. So if I mess around with shortening this buffer to just 10 seconds, it's changed to being 10 seconds, but the information of sample that was outside of that is still there. If we go to 20 seconds, yeah, we can still see this information that was here. If I clear the entire buffer, does it wipe the entire thing? No, it is pushing the buffer further along. What? What? Oh my god, that actually makes no sense. No, okay, that's okay. Clearing the buffer does clear the whole thing. That was just some stupid waveform visualization issue, I guess. If... What are you recording? You're recording one thing. Cool. If I set the sample length really, really long, you should not have a load of crap in there, should you? No. I think it's because I saved its recording. Oh god, is it that weird thing? Every time you record, every time I press save, it starts recording into the buffer. I forgot that even happened. Is that what's happening that's messing me up right here? I think it is. Okay. After all that faffing around, I think it was just that for some reason, whenever you press save, it triggers the recording to begin. I don't know why it happens, but it does seem to. Maybe it's just me. Let's test this out one more time and see how far wrong we have gone. I can set the record size to be 5 seconds long. I can trigger record and record something into the buffer for 5 seconds. Yes. I can say, 5 seconds not quite where we want to be. We just want a 1 second buffer. And that totally clears the buffer. Yes, let's double check by looking in the buffer object. Yes, it does. We could even stretch the buffer to say, actually, I want to be recording 10 seconds long. And that's done a load of weird stuff, hasn't it? If I'm totally, because that almost could have been my and there. Let's try and do 20 seconds long and I'll shut up. Oh my god, what the hell is this? Whenever you change a buffer size with a record object connected to it, when you change the buffer length, it starts recording appended on to the end of the buffer. What? What? Append mode is disabled. Okay. Why would you even want this to happen? I understand there's already some weird behavior whenever I click save. The record object starts recording into the buffer for some unknown reason, which is definitely not what you'd want in any situation I could think of. For some reason, it now turns out if you change the length of a buffer to something shorter, nothing happens. As far as I can tell, it clears the buffer, and that's it. Good. For some reason, if you change a buffer size to be longer that has a record object attached, just changing the buffer size longer is triggering it to start recording into the buffer at the point from the end of the sample onwards. Have I never done this before and discovered that this happens? I mean, quite possibly. Because if I change this size to be 5 seconds, it now stops. But then it's not even happening at 4 seconds. It was happening a second ago. Oh, my brain. I haven't drunk that much already, have I? Well, it doesn't seem to be happening now. Maybe it's because I was pressing save every time. Whenever you press save, it starts recording. Maybe that's what it is. Who knows? Anyway, we're getting near the end of randomly adding more and more things into a sampling algorithm. Turns out there's already the weird bug where whenever you press save, it starts the recording process again. Who knows why? I'm going to send in a weird report about that, because that for sure is just stupidly annoying. Whenever I changed the sample size, it was also doing something horribly weird, but that seems to have stopped for now. So I'm kind of happy about that, at least. Oh no, there you go. It's happening again. It's randomly started recording when I've set in a higher sample size. No, I do not know where that's happening. No, that's not what I'd like to happen. No, it is not useful either. Who knows why it's doing that? Please make it stop. For now, anyway. It's done again. Okay. I'm going to need to submit some bug reports or something to Max, or some posts in the forum, or do a bit of testing and find out why the hell changing buffer sizes of a buffer is triggering recording at different points within the buffer. It makes no sense to me, but hopefully I'll get to the bottom of it. What we did manage to do today was add a cool sample drag and drop thing. We got quite a nice user interface for it, I think, where we can drag in a sample. Oh, sorry, God. Let's actually just go into patching mode for now. Why not? We can go into patching mode, go to the actual device, get rid of the P2P. We can drag in, we can turn on sample drop mode, which shows a nice sample drop interface. We can drag on a sample, which shows us a sample. We can then granulate the sample. And we can do kind of detached pitch and sample scanning, time stretching kind of stuff with it, which is cool. You can even make it reverse if you want to, by reversing the scan and by reversing the direction even, and still get decoupled pitch control. Yeah, it does stuff. Cool. So that's the old cool thing now. You can drag in your own samples and get time stretchy granulary with them, as well as the stuff you're recording in. We've got a nice interface for dragging and dropping the sample. We even have an interface where if you try and drag something in that's not accepted, it tells you it's not accepted and then tells you to do it again. I like that. We can also, so whenever you drag a sample in, it will tell you what the sample is in milliseconds, but you can also set the sample size in bars and beats relative to the current tempo, and you can turn sync off and just be working in milliseconds again if you want to be. One thing we didn't quite get around to doing was setting a way to actually quantize the recording to trigger on the downbeat of a bar. We won't do that today because we've run out of time. But the record object does actually have a transport option where you can link it to a transport. And I think that will do something to quantize it with any luck. Maybe, maybe not. We'll find out. You can link it to a transport and to some degree associated with the transport. I'm not quite sure why. What we generally be doing is setting up something below this record button where when we turn quantize on, you can have a metro object, and the metro object can be sunk to a transport by sending it a you can send a metronome. Is a metro is a metronome object. Basically it bangs at certain times. You can set it in milliseconds. You can also set it in tempo relative terms like we have. So we might set it to a bar. We might make this metronome bang out every bar at the current tempo. We'd be setting up a kind of gating system here. So when we pressed record, it may be flashed or something. And then only at the next actual bar downbeat, it would start recording, turn the button on instead of flashing. So just like in clips in Ableton, where you can make them tempo synced and have this kind of flashing green arrow when it's about to play and flash and off and stuff. So yeah, you would basically be setting up a kind of quantized system like this, where we'd have a play button that would quantize, wait till the next downbeat to play, then it would turn on, and you could also turn it off, maybe quantized as well. Although again, hopefully, because we've managed to set up a system where we can change the length of the sample in beats and bars, we would only need to quantize the start time of the recording, because it would automatically end after, say, 2 bars of our current tempo anyway. But as I mentioned, this record object and buffer is doing some weird ass stuff I had never seen before that I didn't remember. So I will be fiddling with it a bit and maybe asking some questions on forums to try and find out what the hell's going on and stop the weird recording functionality happening. But at least we got sample drag and drop and tempo relative setting the size of the sample. Next up, quantized recording, if we can squeeze it in. As I mentioned, I did tidy up this pitch section here in this probabilities table, so they're actually just live sliders and a list of 8 numbers, so then you can automate and MIDI map them better, which works a bit better, although this list and nice cool multi-slider's cool. It's a nice interface, but not being able to MIDI map it makes it a bit not as cool. Not being able to MIDI map and automate is not as useful in Ableton. And I think one of the final things we'll be doing is setting up some cool envelopes, so we can change this envelope shape to the various different types of envelopes you might want, doing different granular work. Finally, if there's time, we'll make a version of this device that is instead triggered by MIDI. So instead of working as a kind of audio effect, it can be triggered like a MIDI granular synth and sampler, which will especially be handy with our new sample loading thing. So that's what's coming up. Probably another 2 or 3 sessions max on this, and I think we'll have a really fully featured, nice to use granular device, and at that point I'll probably put it up on Gumroad or some other Bandcamp for software, and people will be able to download it or donate a bit of money to get it. Anyway, I think that's about a bit over 2 hours done, so I think I'm done for today. Didn't quite get it all done, but we'll finish it off next time. But hopefully that was a bit of informative information, at least on how to do some drag and drop sample stuff and setting the sample size to tempo relative formats as well. This will be uploaded to YouTube in good high quality, but yeah, you can watch it back on Twitch for now. And I'll see you guys next Sunday, I think. I should be back. Cheers for tuning in. Done for now. See you in a week. Thanks.